Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Regardless of your religion, it is impossible to ignore the impact of Christianity on human history. There are more than 2 billion followers today, nearly 1/3 of the entire population of the planet. Crosses, cathedrals, music, laws, and calendars, all of it traces back to one central figure. But there is a question that divides people to this day. Did the man who started it all, Jesus of Nazareth, really exist? Historians have an answer, and it will surprise you. Fact number 1, the enemy who confirmed everything. In 116 AD, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman senator who also served as governor of Asia, published a historical work called the Annals, where he documented the Roman Empire from the time of Tiberius. Tacitus did not hide what he thought of Christianity. He called this movement a destructive and deadly superstition. This very man included a note about Jesus that no historian has been able to dismiss to this day. Tacitus was explaining why Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, which occurred in 64 AD. For the reader to understand who the Christians were, he wrote, Christus, from whom the name has its origin, suffered the ultimate penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Name, date, governor, method of execution. All recorded in a text whose sole purpose was to document a crisis of the empire, not to prove anything about Jesus. What few people stop to consider, Tacitus had every reason in the world to say that Jesus never existed. If the founder of the Christians were an invention, destroying the myth would have been the most efficient way to end the movement he despised. Tacitus did not do that. He recorded the execution of Jesus as an established fact, in the same tone he used to talk about battles, decrees, and deaths of emperors, without hesitation, without questioning, like someone stating the obvious. Christian and atheist historians agree that the passage from the Annals is authentic. There are no alterations made by Christians in the texts of Tacitus, and if there were, they would be detectable through analysis of style and vocabulary of the work. The man who most despised the followers of Jesus ended up producing one of the most solid pieces of evidence that the founder of the movement really existed. Fact number 2, the Jewish general who did not want to believe. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian who was born around 37 AD into a priestly family, went so far as to lead Jewish military forces against Rome in the Great War that began in 66 AD. After surrendering, he was adopted by the imperial family and began writing the history of his people. He was a devout Jew. He did not sympathize with the Christian movement. Even so, he left 2 direct references to Jesus in his texts. The most solid passage does not mention Jesus directly. It is in Book 20 of the Antiquities of the Jews, describing a judicial proceeding. Josephus writes that the high priest Ananus convened the council of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, whose name was James. Josephus was not talking about Jesus. He was documenting a trial. Jesus appears only as a reference to identify James, something the reader of the time would recognize without any difficulty, the detail that has no easy answer. Josephus grew up in Palestine decades after the death of Jesus. He personally knew people who had seen him preach. If Jesus were a legend invented by the disciples, Josephus would have been one of the first to know, and the first to expose it, since he had every reason to do so. Instead, he used Jesus as a historical reference, so well established that it required no explanation whatsoever. This was not carelessness, it was involuntary acknowledgement. Bart Ehrman, a professor of religion who spent decades questioning the texts of the New Testament, wrote, "If any Jewish writer were in a position to know about the non-existence of Jesus, it would be Josephus. His implicit affirmation of the existence of Jesus continues to be the most significant obstacle for those who argue that the evidence is not sufficient." The greatest intellectual adversary of the Christian movement in the first centuries ended up becoming one of its heaviest pieces of evidence. Fact number 3, the stone that settled a debate. Until 1961, skeptics had a simple argument. Pontius Pilate did not appear in any archaeological source outside of the Bible. If Pilate were an invented character, the story of the crucifixion would collapse with him. In June of that year, an Italian team excavating the Roman theater of Caesarea Maritima, which was the administrative capital of the Romans in Judea at the time, found a limestone block reused as a stair step. The block was about 32 inches tall by 27 inches wide. On the surface, a 4-line Latin inscription. The second line read, Pontius Pilatus, Prefectus Judaeae. Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea. The estimated date, between 26 and 37 AD. Exactly the period in which the Gospels describe the execution of Jesus. It was the first archaeological object to confirm that Pilate was not a character invented by Christian writers for the crucifixion story. The Pilate stone is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It does not prove that Jesus was crucified. but it definitively closes the argument that Pilate was a biblical character with no historical basis. The governor who signed the execution order for Jesus existed. He has a name. He has a title inscribed in limestone from a Roman theater. What nobody expected was that another piece of evidence of Pilate would surface again later. Fact number 4, the ring that was forgotten for 50 years. In 1968, excavations at the Herodium, the palace fortress built by King Herod, located about 7.5 miles south of Jerusalem, revealed among the finds a very simple copper ring. No gold, no precious stone, nothing that caught the attention of whoever cataloged it at that moment. The ring was stored in a deposit of the Israel Antiquities Authority and remained practically forgotten for an entire half-century. In 2018, researchers took the ring out of storage, cleaned it carefully, and photographed it in high resolution. They found 2 words engraved in Greek on the surface, De Pilatus. Rings like this were used to seal documents with hot wax. The bearer pressed the engraved surface as an official signature. The name Pilate was extremely rare in the Roman Empire, and the palace of Herod was precisely where Pilate usually stayed during his visits to Judea. A theater stone, a copper ring in storage for 50 years, 2 objects found in different locations, in different decades, with the same name engraved. The governor whom the Gospels place as the man who signed the execution order for Jesus has 2 physical objects with his name recorded. Pilate was not just a character from a sacred book. Fact number 5, the only crucified bone in history. In 1968, a construction company clearing a lot in northeast Jerusalem found a 1st century AD tomb. Inside, there were several limestone boxes, the typical way Jews of that era stored the bones of the dead after the body had decomposed. One of those boxes bore the name Yehohanan, son of Hagol. When they opened it, they found something that changed what science knew about crucifixion. Inside, there was a heel bone with a 4.5-inch iron nail still driven through it. The nail had bent upon hitting a knot in the wood of the cross and became impossible to remove. That is why it was buried along with the bone. Around the metal, there were remains of olive wood, part of the piece used to fix the foot to the beam. It was the first and only physical proof of a Roman crucifixion ever found. The method of execution described in the Gospels actually existed. Up to that point, 2 arguments circulated to question the Gospels: that crucifixions used ropes, not nails, and that crucified people never received a proper burial. The case of Yehohanan demolished both at the same time. He had iron nails in his heel. Someone from the family claimed the body and buried it in an identified box. Inside a family tomb. Exactly the type of burial the Gospels describe in the case of Jesus of Nazareth. Yehohanan was between 24 and 28 years old when he died. What he did to be crucified by the Romans was not recorded anywhere. The nail that bent upon hitting a knot in the wood and became impossible to remove ended up being, 2,000 years later, the only physical trace of a method of execution that many called literary exaggeration. A replica of the box is in the Israel Museum. The actual bones were reburied as required by Jewish religious law. This is no longer a debate. Fact number 6, the bone box of the man who condemned Jesus. In 1990, a construction company building a water park south of Jerusalem had its excavator break through the ceiling of a 1st century AD tomb. Archaeologists were called. Inside, there were several stone boxes for storing bones. One of them was visibly more ornate than the others. On the side, a simple inscription that left the team in silence for a few seconds when it was read aloud. The inscription read, in Aramaic, Joseph bar Caiaphas, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. The box contained the bones of 6 people, including those of a man approximately 60 years old whom researchers identify as Caiaphas himself. A coin from 43 AD found inside helped confirm the date. Caiaphas was the high priest who presided over the trial of Jesus before the Council of Judges, according to all 4 Gospels and also according to Flavius Josephus. Fact number 7, brother of Jesus engraved in stone. In October 2002, a 1st century AD limestone box came to public attention in a publication specializing in biblical archaeology. The box was about 20 inches long. On the side, there were 20 letters in Aramaic, the language spoken in Palestine at that time. André Lemaire, a specialist in ancient Semitic inscriptions from the University of Paris, examined the text, went silent for a moment, and declared what he was seeing. The inscription read, Yaakov bar Yosef Akui di Yeshua, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Bone boxes rarely mentioned the brother of the deceased. They did so only when that brother was a public figure well known enough to serve as an identifying reference. The logic is straightforward. You write brother of Jesus on a 1st century bone box only if whoever was going to read it knew exactly who this Jesus was without needing any explanation. In 2003, the Israel Antiquities Authority accused the owner of the box of forgery. The trial lasted 7 years. In 2012, the judge acquitted the defendant. One of the central reasons for the acquittal, a photograph from 1976 showed the box on the collector's shelf, 4 years before any discovery that could have motivated someone to fabricate this specific inscription. The inscription was examined by 2 independent specialists. Both concluded it was genuinely ancient. It is not absolute proof, but it is strong evidence. It is 1st century AD Aramaic, and it has 3 names, James, Joseph, Jesus, that correspond exactly to the family of Jesus, described by Flavius Josephus and by the letters of Paul of Tarsus. Ben Witherington, a New Testament scholar, was direct. If this is the box of the James mentioned in 1st century sources, it is the most important extra-biblical evidence for the existence of Jesus ever found. Fact number 8. The Roman governor who interrogated the Christians. Around 112 AD, Gaius Caecilius Plinius Secundus, a Roman senator who governed the region that today corresponds to northern Turkey, encountered an administrative problem he did not know how to solve. Groups of people in his region refused to worship the emperor. He wrote to Emperor Trajan asking for guidance on what to do with these groups and how to conduct the trials against them. In the letter, Pliny describes what he discovered after interrogating members of the group, including using torture. They had the habit of meeting on a fixed day before dawn and singing hymns to Christ as if to a god. Pliny was not a Christian. He had no sympathy whatsoever for the movement. He had a public order problem on his hands. The letter is a purely bureaucratic document, and yet it recorded without any intention the existence of a cult to someone who had lived on earth. 112 AD, less than 80 years after the death of Jesus, a Roman governor with no religious interest whatsoever documents, in a letter to the emperor, that numerous groups worshiped Jesus as a real historical figure, a man who lived, not an abstract god. This does not prove that Jesus existed, but it proves that less than a century after the crucifixion, the story was already established enough to reach a government official in Turkey and become a public order problem. Fact number 9. Lucian of Samosata, a Greek writer of the 2nd century AD, it says, was one of the fiercest satirists of his time. He was pagan, intellectual, and did not hide his contempt for Christians. Around 165 AD, he published a text called The Death of Peregrinus, a story that ridiculed a contemporary philosopher who had converted to Christianity. In the middle of the joke, Lucian confirmed something that was no joke at all. When describing the Christians in the text, Lucian wrote, "They worship to this day a man, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account." Lucian was not arguing that Jesus existed. He was humiliating the Christians for worshiping an executed criminal. For this joke to work for the Roman audience of the time, the story of the crucifixion had to be a well-known cultural reference, something any reader would recognize without needing an explanation. This is the pattern of all enemies of Jesus in the 2nd century AD. None of them says he never existed. They say he was a magician, an impostor, a criminal, a sorcerer. They attack what Jesus did, never his existence. It is the standard behavior of anyone who attacks any real historical figure. Enemies debate the acts, not whether the person was alive. The adversaries of Jesus followed this logic without realizing what it would mean 2,000 years later. Fact number 10. The Jewish texts that attack but never deny. The Babylonian Talmud is a collection of texts by Jewish rabbis compiled between 70 and 500 AD. It is, by definition, hostile to the Christian movement. It contains passages explicitly critical of Jesus. What almost nobody mentions is the following. At no point in the Talmud does anyone claim that Jesus did not exist. The rabbi's strategy was not to deny the existence, it was to destroy the reputation. This distinction is fundamental. The rabbinic texts refer to someone called Yeshu, identified by historians as Jesus, and describe him as a practitioner of magic who led Israel astray from the right path. The execution is mentioned on the eve of Passover, which matches the chronology of the Gospels. You do not discredit someone who never existed. If Jesus were a myth, the most efficient refutation would have been to prove it. The greatest historical enemies of Jesus did not try. That specific silence says a great deal. There's a second important Jewish text, the Toledat Yeshu, an anti-Christian narrative whose oldest records are medieval, but which probably preserves much older oral traditions. The Toledat says that Jesus was the son of adultery with a man named Pantera, that he learned sorcery in Egypt, and that his disciples tried to hide the body to claim he had ascended to heaven. The text attacks forcefully, but assumes without hesitation that Jesus was a real person. The most revealing detail appears when the sources are compared. The Toledat Yeshu says the father of Jesus was a man named Pantera. The pagan Roman philosopher Celsus, writing in the 2nd century AI. The AD, based on completely different sources, says exactly the same thing. Two hostile sources of distinct origins with the same specific and independent accusation. This indicates a very ancient anti-Christian oral tradition, presupposing the existence of a real and concrete Jesus. Fact number 11. The joke that became evidence. In 1857, archaeologists excavating the Palatine Hill in Rome opened a room in the imperial palace that had been sealed for centuries. On one of the walls, there was a drawing scratched into the plaster. Crude, poorly made, clearly drawn by someone with time to spare and a desire to provoke a colleague. That room was part of a school where young men were trained to serve the emperor's court. The drawing was a joke among students. The image showed a man on a cross with the head of a donkey. Next to him, another figure with an arm raised in worship. Below, in Greek, Alexamenos worships his god. Someone had drawn it to mock a Christian colleague named Alexamenos. For the joke to work among the students of the palace, the audience needed to recognize the reference immediately. Christians worship a man who was crucified. It was an established cultural reference, not an explanation of something obscure. This drawing is dated between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. It is the oldest image of Jesus on a crucifixion that exists in the world. And it was not made by any Christian. It was made by someone who wanted to laugh at a Christian. What this confirms, in a school corridor of the Roman imperial palace, the story of the crucifixion of Jesus circulated as a cultural reference known to any young man who studied there, not as a rumor or an obscure doctrine of a minority. Fact number 12, the image that science cannot reproduce. The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth measuring about 14 feet, 5 inches by 3 feet, 7 inches, with the faint image of a man. It has been kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, since the 16th century. According to a survey published by Harvard researchers in 2023, it is one of the most studied objects in all of human history, and science has still not answered the most basic question about it. In 1978, a group called the Shroud of Turin Research Project assembled 33 scientists from several countries with 5 days and the best equipment available to examine the cloth. The formal conclusion of the report was the following: the image is not a painting. There are no residues of paint or dye of any kind. It is not the result of any chemical process the group was able to identify or reproduce in a laboratory. After 5 days of intensive analysis, the origin of the image remained unknown. In 1988, 3 different laboratories dated the cloth using the carbon-14 method and arrived at the same result. The origin would be between the 13th and 14th centuries AD. For many people, the matter was settled. In 2024, the Italian Institute of Crystallography used a completely different technique to analyze the aging of the linen fibers. The result contradicts the 1988 laboratories. The data are compatible with 2,000 years of age for the fabric. The most accepted hypothesis today is that the sample used in 1988 came from a medieval patch sewn under the cloth after a fire in 1532, and not from the original fabric. The marks on the cloth correspond to the injuries described in the Gospels: scourging on the back, thorn wounds on the head, punctures in the wrists and heels, a wound on the right side. The blood tested is type AB, more common in Middle Eastern populations. No forgery hypothesis has passed technical scrutiny. Fact number 13. The imprisoned philosopher who mentioned the wise king. Mara bar Serapion, a philosopher who lived in Syria within the Roman Empire, wrote a letter to his son from inside a Roman prison shortly after 73 AD, 40 years after the death of Jesus. He was not a Christian. He had no interest whatsoever in defending or attacking the movement founded by Jesus. The letter is a philosophical reflection on historical injustice and the price the world pays for punishing its wise men. In the letter, Mara cites 3 historical cases of wise men unjustly executed: Socrates, Pythagoras, and a third, described as follows: what did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? Mara does not name Jesus, but wise king of the Jews, executed by his own people, with serious historical consequences for the nation, is the reference historians identify as Jesus. He is a pagan Syrian imprisoned by Romans, with no interest in defending or attacking the Christian movement in any way. 40 years after the crucifixion, a philosopher in a Roman cell uses Jesus as an obvious example in a letter to his son, without needing to explain who he is. This only works if the story was already widely recognized as an established historical fact. Mara was not citing a rumor. He was citing something that, for him, was as established as the death of Socrates. This type of casual reference without explanation is specific to figures the reader already recognizes as real. Fact number 14. The imperial decree that nobody explains well. At some point in the 19th century, a marble block with a Greek inscription arrived in Paris with the information that it had come from Nazareth, the town where Jesus supposedly grew up. It was purchased by Emperor Napoleon III for the French National Collection, and was kept in the National Library for several decades before anyone examined it carefully enough to notice what was written there. It was an imperial decree, a direct order from the Roman emperor, probably Claudius, from the 1st century AD. The text prohibited the violation of tombs, the removal of bodies, and the transfer of bones between graves. The established penalty? Death. Roman decrees normally did not reach this level of punishment for cases of grave violation. It was a disproportionate response for a relatively common crime, which led historians to ask why. The hypothesis that circulates among historians: the decree was a direct response to the turmoil caused by the resurrection story, specifically to the accusation that the disciples of Jesus stole the body to fabricate a miracle. The time period matches the reign of Claudius, the location matches, the specificity of the penalty, death for moving bones, corresponds exactly to what the Romans accused the Christians of having done. It is difficult to ignore this combination without a better alternative explanation. Fact number 15, the historian who recorded without realizing it. Gaius Suetonius. Tranquillus, a Roman writer who lived between the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, spent his life documenting the biographies of the first 12 emperors. In the biography of Emperor Claudius, who ruled Rome between 41 and 54 AD, he recorded an administrative action among many others. Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because they were making constant disturbances on account of Christus. Christus was the common Latin way of writing the title Christ, which in Greek means anointed, and which translated the Hebrew Messiah. The expulsion of Jews from Rome by Claudius is an event also mentioned in the Book of Acts of the Apostles. Most historians understand that the disturbances cited by Suetonius were conflicts between Jews, who rejected Christian messianism, and Jews who were embracing it. Conflicts caused directly by the preaching about Jesus. What makes this passage valuable is the lack of intention. Suetonius was not trying to prove anything about Jesus. He was listing the administrative acts of an emperor. Jesus appears as contextual data in a bureaucratic note of a text about imperial administration with no religious purpose whatsoever. It is the type of mention that confirms historical existence without meaning to, like a name in a 1st century AD Roman public order record, filed away without imagining it would matter. Fact number 16, the philosopher who tried to destroy Christianity. Celsus was a philosopher and physician of Neoplatonic orientation who lived in the 2nd century AD. Around 177 AD, he published a treatise called The True Doctrine, the first systematic philosophical attack on Christianity on record. The objective was clear: to destroy the movement point by point, attacking the origin of Jesus, his teachings, his miracles, and the credibility of his followers. Celsus said that Jesus was the son of a poor peasant woman who became pregnant through adultery with a Roman soldier named Pantera, and that to hide this, Jesus had invented the story that he was born of a virgin. He said the miracles Jesus performed were sorcery learned in Egypt. He said Jesus gave himself the title of God out of personal pride. And at no point in the treatise did Celsus raise the hypothesis that Jesus had not existed. That specific point he never questioned. What Celsus does throughout the entire treatise is offer alternative explanations for the claims of the Christians. Never deny that Jesus existed. Jesus had powers, yes, but it was sorcery. He was born of a virgin, yes, but it was to hide an adultery. He was considered God, yes, but that was a title Jesus himself had invented. The pattern is identical to that of Josephus, Lucian, and the Talmud. The adversary attacks what Jesus did, never whether he was really here. And there is an additional detail in the case of Celsus. He says the biological father of Jesus was a man named Pantera. The Toledot Yeshu, a Jewish text that preserves ancient anti-Christian traditions, says exactly the same thing, drawing from completely different sources. Two hostile sources of distinct origins, with the same specific accusation about the same detail. This indicates a very ancient anti-Christian oral tradition, circulating independently and presupposing a real historical Jesus. Fact number 17, the oldest texts about Jesus. Of the 27 parts that make up the New Testament, 13 are letters attributed to Paul of Tarsus. Of that total, the majority of historians consider that at least 7 were actually written by Paul, and these 7 date from around the 50s AD. This makes them the oldest existing texts about Jesus, predating even the 4 Gospels, written between 70 and 90 AD. In these letters, Paul describes Jesus unequivocally as a real man of flesh and blood, born of a woman, had brothers, made disciples while he was alive, was brought to trial, was executed by crucifixion, and was buried. Paul openly admits that he did not know Jesus while he was alive. But he records that he personally knew Peter and other disciples who had lived alongside Jesus, and that he personally met James, the brother of Jesus, in Jerusalem. This detail about James is revealing. Paul writes to the communities that this James was alive, was the leader of the Christian community in Jerusalem while Paul was preaching, and that the two disagreed on several doctrinal points. If Paul were inventing the existence of Jesus, why would he invent a living brother, identifiable, accessible? and who was moreover a doctrinal adversary with whom Paul had recorded disagreements. This does not make sense from any angle. Paul was writing to communities where there were people who had known Jesus in his lifetime. If Jesus had never existed, someone in those communities would have known, and it would have destroyed the movement from within before any external persecution. Instead, what appears in Paul's letters are debates about what Jesus taught, about the meaning of what he did, about the interpretation of his words. Debates about the existence of Jesus never appear, not in Paul's letters, not in any other source from the period. Fact number 18, the tomb with his name. On March 28, 1980, workers from a construction company in the Talpiot neighborhood, south of Jerusalem, stopped work when the ground gave way under the equipment. They called the archaeologists. Underneath, there was an intact 1st century AD tomb with 10 limestone bone boxes. 6 had inscriptions in Aramaic. When the researchers began reading the engraved names aloud, they could not believe it. The 6 inscribed boxes bore Yeshua bar Yehoseph, Jesus, son of Joseph, Maria, Yose, a nickname for the brother of Jesus mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, Mariamene and Mara, Mattia, Matthew, and a 6th box with the inscription Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judas, son of a Yeshua. The documentarians interpreted this Yeshua as being Jesus of Nazareth, which would imply that Jesus had a son. This was the part most rejected by archaeologists. In 2007, filmmaker James Cameron and journalist Simcha Jacobovici brought the case to the public in a documentary. A statistics expert from the University of Toronto calculated the probabilities. The specific set of names in this combination, in this era, in this city, would be 600 to 1 in favor of it being the tomb of the family of Jesus of Nazareth. The majority of archaeologists disagreed with the conclusion. The names were too common for this calculation to work with sufficient precision. The tomb was reburied after the initial excavation. Jewish religious law requires this with any disturbed burial. Today there's a residential building on top of the site. What no archaeologist denies is that there existed, in the 1st century in Jerusalem, a real family with the exact names of Jesus, Joseph, Mary, James, and Judas, with the resources to have a tomb carved in rock. The Talpiot tomb does not prove anything with certainty, but it is also not easy to explain away as a simple coincidence. Fact number 19, the boat with room for 13. In 1986, a severe drought lowered the level of the Sea of Galilee to a historic point. 2 brothers fishing on the northern shore of the lake saw ancient wood emerging from the mud. They notified the authorities. The excavation that followed lasted 12 days under extreme conditions. The mud had to be kept constantly moist so the wood would not disintegrate upon contact with air. The dating confirmed. The boat was from the 1st century AD. The boat measures about 26 feet long by 7.5 feet wide. The analysis of the wood identified 10 different species used over the life of the vessel, a sign of constant patching, of a boat pushed to the limit by fishermen who did not have the resources to replace it entirely. The estimated capacity, 12 people plus a helmsman, exactly the number that appears in the gospel scenes, describing Jesus and the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. The boat is on display at the Yigal Allon Museum on the shores of the Sea of Galilee in Israel. It has no name engraved on it. There is no way to prove that Jesus sailed in it, but there is a way to show what fishing life was like on that lake in the 1st century AD, wood patched from 10 species, capacity for 13 people, built in a poor lakeside village. The environment the Gospels describe existed. Fact number 20, the childhood home. In 2009, archaeologists excavating beneath the International Center of Mary of Nazareth found the first 1st century AD residence identified within the town of Nazareth. It was a simple limestone structure, partially carved directly into the rock, dated by means of pottery and coins from the period. For centuries, one of the skeptical arguments was that Nazareth might not have existed as a town in the 1st century AD. The house had limestone walls, a cistern in the courtyard, and domestic objects typical of a poor Jewish family of the period. Clay vessels, worked limestone fragments. Ken Dark, an archaeologist from the University of Reading who led the excavations, was precise in stating, "I am not saying this is the house of Jesus. I am saying it is the exact type of house in which Jesus would have grown up. In the right town at the right time, with the correct materials and architecture." Nazareth existed in the 1st century AD. It had stone houses, cisterns, clay vessels. It was the poor, rural Jewish village the Gospels describe, far from the centers of power on the margins of Galilee, without political or economic prominence. The argument that Nazareth was a literary invention of the Gospel writers no longer has archaeological support. The town exists in the historical record. The context exists. The man who supposedly grew up there becomes increasingly difficult to deny. Fact number 21, more documented than his contemporaries. Few people stop to calculate this pattern objectively. Julius Caesar has 5 historical sources from antiquity. Socrates has sources written decades after his death, none written by himself. Alexander the Great is well documented, but no written source contemporary to his life survived. Jesus of Nazareth has, within a century of the crucifixion, at least 14 independent, documented, and verified sources. Of those 14 sources, at least 7 are from non-Christians or from people openly hostile to the movement. Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny, Suetonius, Lucian, Marabar, Serapion, and the Talmud. No other figure of a similar social level in 1st century AD Galilee has comparable historical documentation. The British historian Michael Grant, who was not religious, concluded, "If we apply the normal criteria, we cannot reject Jesus any more than we reject pagan figures never questioned. Pilate exists, Caiaphas exists, Nazareth exists, the method of execution exists, the boat exists, the house exists. Every element of the historical context in which Jesus lived is confirmed in the archaeology. The only piece some still refuse is the central character, the man that all the other pieces confirm. At some point, this stops being honest intellectual skepticism and becomes something else. Professional historians, whether atheist, Christian, Jewish, or agnostic, realized this a long time ago. The academic position today is straightforward. The absolute majority of historians specializing in the period, regardless of each one's personal beliefs, consider that Jesus of Nazareth existed as a real historical person. Not that he was resurrected, not that he performed miracles, not that he was the Son of God. That he existed, that he was a Jew from 1st century AD, Galilee who gathered disciples and was executed by the Romans. That specific point history considers established. What comes after is faith.